Well, as you can imagine, the reaction from African American leaders varied quite substantially. Some advocated an approach of assimilation whereby blacks would achieve racial progress through education and accommodation, not by challenging segregation through courts. The most prominent voice of this approach was Booker T. Washington. Washington was, without question, the single most well-known African American of his time and perhaps the most celebrated black person in the entire world. A former slave, he obtained an education and in 1881 founded the Tuskegee Institute, which was an all-black vocational school in Alabama, largely devoted to training teachers. There, Washington developed a philosophy that blacks' best hopes lay in at least temporarily accommodating whites. Rather than fighting for political rights, Washington counseled African Americans to work hard, acquire property, and prove they were worthy of respect. He represented the ideals of millions of African Americans who hoped education and hard work would erase white prejudice and that whites would respect economic success. In an 1895 speech that became known as the Atlanta Compromise, Washington assured whites that blacks and whites could work together. Because he said what they wanted to hear, whites greeted this address with enthusiasm. His visibility won him international fame, and he became an advisor to Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. In 1901, President Roosevelt invited Washington to dine with his family at the White House, even though segregation was law. News of the dinner between a former slave and the President of the United States became a national sensation and only increased Washington's standing among whites. But of course, not everyone agreed with Washington's approach. Many believed that blacks needed to be more vigilant and aggressively pursue unrestricted voting rights, economic opportunity, integration, and equality before the law. Washington's most vocal critic was W.E.B. Du Bois. As the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard, Du Bois was a progressive and a member of the black elite. He treated Washington politely, but he could not accept accommodation. Du Bois asserted that blacks must agitate for what was rightfully theirs. In 1909, he joined white liberals, also discontented with Washington's accommodationism, to form the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The organization aimed to end racial discrimination, eradicate lynching, and obtain voting rights through legal redress in the courts. By 1914, the NAACP had 50 branch offices and 6,000 members. Other blacks who could not see the utility of Washington or Du Bois's approach simply chose to move out of the South, where they believed they would find greater opportunities for jobs and where whites would be more accepting. America's involvement in World War I, which required a mass mobilization to support U.S. and Allied troops abroad, encouraged a great migration of Southern African Americans to northern cities to work in railroad yards, packing houses, steel mills, shipyards, and coal mines. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, 1.5 million blacks moved from the South to the North, doubling the African American populations of Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit. In New York City, the Great Migration tripled the black population in the decade after 1910. Harlem stood as a symbol of liberty and the promised land to blacks everywhere. Talented African Americans flocked to the district where they celebrated black culture during what became known as the Harlem Renaissance. The 1921 musical comedy Shuffle Along is often credited with launching the Harlem Renaissance, but the Renaissance also featured talented black artists such as poets Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, novelists Zoa Hurston, and essayist Alain Locke. To millions of Americans, the most famous product of the Harlem Renaissance was jazz. Some of the most celebrated names in American music regularly performed in Harlem: Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Fats Waller, and Cab Calloway, and many others. But not even the glamour of Harlem could erase the reality of racial discrimination in Manhattan. Most African Americans could find work only in New York City's least desired and lowest paying jobs. African Americans experienced the highest rate of residential segregation of any minority group. Harlem became a black ghetto, an area set apart from the rest of the city by the skin color of its inhabitants, by its higher population density and poverty rate, by its higher incidence of infectious diseases, and by the lower life expectancy of its people. Beyond discrimination, the rapid growth of African Americans in the North led to an outbreak of violence between whites and blacks in several northern cities. The worst anti-black violence occurred in Chicago after World War I. Here, in July 19, a black teenager who had been swimming in Lake Michigan was killed by whites after coming too close to a whites-only beach. Rioting soon broke out throughout the city, with white mobs invading black neighborhoods, torching homes and stores, and attacking innocent residents. Led by war veterans, some of whom were armed, blacks fought back, turning the border areas between white and black neighborhoods into battle zones. The riots, which killed 23 African Americans, made it clear to blacks that the North was not the promised land. Confined to unskilled jobs and segregated neighborhoods with substandard housing and high rents, black migrants in Chicago, New York, and other northern cities suffered severe economic hardship through the 1920s. The NAACP carried on its campaign for civil rights and racial equality, but many blacks no longer shared the belief that they could one day be accepted as first-class citizens. They turned instead to an immigrant from Jamaica named Marcus Garvey. Garvey called on blacks to give up their hopes for integration and to set about forging a separate black nation. He reminded blacks that they possessed a rich culture stretching back over the centuries that would enable them to achieve greatness as a nation. Garvey wanted to build a black nation in Africa that would bring together all the world's people of African descent. In the short term, he wanted to help American and Caribbean blacks achieve economic and cultural independence. Garvey's call for black separatism and self-sufficiency, or black nationalism as it came to be called, elicited a remarkable response among blacks in the United States. In the early 1920s, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which Garvey had founded, enrolled millions of members. His newspaper, The Negro World, reached a circulation of 200,000. Garvey's most visible economic venture was the Black Star Line, a shipping company with 3 ships that proudly flew the association's flag from their masts. The black nationalist movement did not endure for long, though. Garvey entered into bitter disputes with other black leaders, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who regarded him as a flamboyant, self-serving demagogue. Garvey sometimes showed poor judgment, as when he expressed support for the Ku Klux Klan on the grounds that it shared his pessimism about the possibility of racial integration. Garvey also squandered money on ill-conceived business ventures. In 1923, he was convicted of mail fraud involving the sale of Black Star Line stock and was sentenced to 5 years in jail. In 1927, he was deported to Jamaica and the UNIA folded. With Garvey gone and the NAACP making little headway, there was little progress in race relations over the next decade, and particularly during the Great Depression. It would take the Second World War, arguably the most important event of the 20th century, and the wartime message of freedom to portend a major transformation in the status of blacks.